tonight to speak against the Mineral Resource Rent Tax and Repeal and Other Measures Bill. Labor believes that all Australians own a share of our mineral resources. Labor believes that all Australians should share in the profits that come from extracting our natural resources. That is why Labor believes, when in government, we introduced the MRRT. Now, those opposite are seeking to repeal this tax. The Abbott government is happy to see all these profits go straight into the pockets of just a few people. This government is beholden to the special interests of big business and the super rich. This government, as their first budget has clearly shown, do not understand the pressures facing low and middle income Australians. To justify the repeal of this tax and the so-called related measures in this bill, those opposite rely on two contradictory arguments. Firstly, they argue that this tax is hurting industry. Secondly, they argue that it is not raising any revenue. Mr Acting Deputy President, they can't have it both ways. In addition to repealing the MRRT, the bill before us today acts as a variety of government payments, support bonuses and tax benefits tax breaks that benefit Australians. These are initiatives introduced by the Labor government that make life a little easier for families, school children, retirees and businesses. But now those opposite want mining companies making super profits to pay less tax, and they want small businesses and the lowest paid workers to pay more tax. This legislation is a retrospective tax grab which will hit millions of Australians, low-income earners, families and small businesses, and give a tax refund to large mining companies. And that is why Labor will again oppose this bill, the removal of the Minerals Resource Rent Tax and the associated measures. In some of these associated measures which I wish to speak about further. And the first of those measures, Mr Acting Deputy President, is the school kids bonus, which is one of the measures in this bill. Now, I think many in this chamber will remember that the Treasurer, Mr Hockey, introduced, put this legislation out to the public late last year on a Friday, and attached to it, to many people's amazement, was the repeal of the school kids bonus, that it was actually attached to this piece of legislation. Now, this is a payment that currently benefits over 2.2 million school-aged children across the nation. A payment that is not, I believe, linked in any way with the MRRT, despite the government's rhetoric. This is a vital payment that helps low and middle-income families to ensure that children are equipped and ready to engage in school. According to the evidence given to the Economic Legislation Committee inquiry into the Minerals Resource Rent Tax Repeal and Other Measures Bill, ACOS has said that 1 in 6 children in Australia are living in poverty. Mr Acting Deputy President, that is over 500,000 children whose families may be unable to buy them their school shoes or books without the school kids bonus. These are the very same families that have been hardest hit by the vicious cuts in the Abbott government's budget. And I also have to indicate, from the evidence that has been provided in my home state of Tasmania by the School Association and the President, Ms Jenny Eddington, she's indicated quite strongly how important this particular payment is to families to enable them to provide the necessaries that children need to be able to go to school, and how effective, Mr Acting Deputy President, that this payment actually is. So earlier this month, about 1.3 million families welcomed the July instalment of the school kids bonus, and that this instalment of $205 per primary school student and $410 per high school student will help families. And it's been shown that it's been effective and is helping families with the cost of school uniforms, shoes and sports equipment. Mr Acting Deputy President, in my home state of Tasmania, more than 35,000 families receive this payment. Many of these families have contacted me to tell me how important this payment has been, and just recently we did table a petition in the Senate of people asking that the school kids bonus be spared from the Abbott government's acts. Now, the Tasmanian Association of State Schools Organisation President Jenny Eddington told me that the surveys that they have conducted has shown that the families rely heavily on this payment to properly equip their children. And I wish to quote Ms Eddington, and she said, "It's important we keep this bonus. It's one of the single most valuable payments that has been made in recent years." End quote. Now, school associations have told me that since the school kids bonus was introduced, there's been more children arriving better prepared to start the school year, and that there are less parents taking out payment plans to pay off their levies. I know that those opposite do not understand this. They don't understand the financial pressures facing families, or they wouldn't be doing this. They wouldn't be taking out this measure. They don't understand how important this payment is to help families meet the cost of their children's education. It is a fair and reasonable payment that has helped many Tasmanian families, especially those on low and middle incomes. But as we've seen in the Abbott government's first budget, they don't understand, or they don't care. I prefer to believe they don't understand the financial pressures facing low and middle income families. You know, we need to ensure that our children are as best equipped as possible to be able to get a great education. And it's a real kick for hard-working families putting their children through school. Scrapping the school kids bonus means that the average Australian family with 2 kids will be $1,230 worse off every year and $15,000 worse off over the life of their child's education. It is a cruel and underhanded move by the Abbott government that will hurt families who are already struggling. Not only is this government ripping off Australian families, it's trying to fool them about the reasons why. Mr Acting Deputy President, those opposite claim that the school kids bonus was paid for by the MRRT. It was not. It has nothing to do with the Minerals Resource Package, and those opposite know it. The school kids bonus replaced the education tax refund. The education tax refund was introduced in 2008 to help families cover the cost of educating their children. However, more than 80% of families did not claim the full amount they were entitled to, and 20% did not claim anything at all. Some families lost their receipts or simply did not keep them, or were unable, obviously, Mr Acting Deputy President, to afford to pay for their children's school uniforms or other education costs first up, and then wait months or even up to a year for a reimbursement on their tax. The school kids bonus simplified the process by making 2 upfront payments to parents when they needed it most. This government is trying to play Australian families for fools by repealing the school kids bonus as part of this package, as a part of this bill. Now, this government seems also content on misleading the Australian people, blaming their minerals resource rent tax for cuts that have absolutely nothing to do with the tax. When the Prime Minister visited Tasmania, he said regional development funding would be scrapped because it was paid for by the minerals resource rent tax. Here's what he said at a press conference in Wynyard in northwest Tasmania when asked about the Regional Development Australia Fund grant budgeted in May for the redevelopment of the Royal Hobart Showgrounds in Glenorchy in the electorate of Denison. And he said, I quote, "It was associated with the mining tax because we are abolishing the mining tax. We would abolish the programs and funding associated with it, unless we specifically committed to it ourselves. Sure, the government announced money for the showgrounds out of the government at that time, of being the Labor government, announced the money for the showgrounds out of those funds. We didn't match it, so we're not committed to it." So Mr Abbott is trying to use the Minerals Resource Rent Tax as a front to scrap vital infrastructure funding for Tasmania, a job-creating project. It showed the Prime Minister clearly hadn't done his homework and he had clearly no regard for jobs in Tasmania. The money for the showgrounds was not a part of the Minerals Resource Rent Tax. Labor put this money in the budget under the Regional Development Australia Fund. Despite the fact that he had his wires crossed and he hadn't done his homework, Mr Abbott's statement clearly shows that he'd rather line the pockets of big mining companies than help communities like mine create jobs and growth. Now, Mr Acting Deputy President, I'd like to talk briefly about the low-income superannuation contribution, which helps 1/3 of the Australian workforce. It is also on the chopping block here tonight, and Mr Abbott's government plans to implement it retrospectively. The low-income superannuation contribution currently benefits almost 3.6 million Australians who earn up to $37,000 per year by refunding their superannuation tax by up to $500 each year. We should not penalise, Mr Acting Deputy President, we should not penalise the lowest paid workers in our society for saving for their retirement, and certainly not retrospectively. Those hurt most by losing their low-income superannuation contribution are those who can least afford it. Analysis done last year showed that 87,000 Tasmanians would benefit from the low-income superannuation contribution. And now checkout operators, office cashiers, childcare employees, hairdressers, hospitality workers, midwives and receptionists and many others will lose this support. Part-time workers, young workers, older workers and half of the female Australian workforce will be hit by this move. Women face many challenges when saving for their retirement. We are paid less on average, often leave the workforce temporarily to have children, are overrepresented in lower-paid jobs and face barriers later in life. It is sickening that the Minerals Resource Rent Tax Repeal Bill, which puts more money in the pockets of big miners, penalises half of the female workforce in this country. It goes completely against the Australians' values of equality and fairness. The ABC has reported that, according to the industry Super Australia, this action by the coalition, those opposite, would cut as much as $27,000 from retirement savings from almost 3.6 million Australians. Again, mostly, I'll repeat, for those benefit of those opposite, mostly women and young workers. This is according to the body representing industry funds, Industry Super Australia. Now, Industry Super Australia's Chief Executive, David Whiteley, says the changes are unfair and unsustainable. The ISA submission also says the changes will disproportionately affect 4 in 10 regional and rural Australians. Mr Whiteley said the changes leave low-income workers without a tax concession on their superannuation, while those on high incomes already receive concessions. To quote Mr Whiteley, "We would be very keen to see that this committee recommends to the Parliament that every option is exhausted to make sure that all Australians are getting access to tax concessions on their super." End quote. The ISA warns axing the rebate will undermine efforts to improve half of the working Australian women's retirement savings, including 80% of female part-time workers. All this as Mr Abbott's government plans to roll back the proposed 15% tax on superannuation earnings over $100,000 a year. As our population gets older, how on earth can it make sense to gut superannuation savings of ordinary working Australians? Surely the government would want retirees to prepare for an independent retirement. But here Mr Abbott is hacking away at superannuation savings of low-income earning Australians to line the pockets of big miners. It's bad enough to ramp up taxes on workers who can least afford it, but making the rules retrospective is cruel. The Liberals have never supported the superannuation guarantee. Mr Abbott is on record as saying to Parliament as far back as 1995, compulsory superannuation is one of the biggest con jobs ever foisted by governments on the Australian people. And again, Madam Acting Deputy President, in 2012 stated again, We have always, as a coalition, been against compulsory superannuation increases. This is a government that is against helping out hard-working Australians on lower incomes, all the while shoveling money back onto the pile of money the big miners are already in possession of. It's not how the resources of this country should be used. The benefits they bring should be shared by all of us, especially those in our workforce. But this sort of mean-spirited move is, after just a few months, already becoming Mr Abbott's government's trademark. Now, I will take just a few minutes also to comment on the increase to the instant asset tax write-off loss carryback tax incentives, because as this measure shows that it's not just workers that in Mr Abbott's sights. The leader of the Liberal Party, the so-called friend of small business, plans to make life tougher for small business as well. The Prime Minister plans to axe Labor's increase to the instant asset tax write-off, which saves businesses thousands of dollars at tax time. Under Labor's initiative, small businesses were able to write off depreciating assets that cost less than $6,500. Now, those businesses have been given until January the 1st to make their purchases before the figure reverts to the former Howard government's figure of $1,000. The loss carryback tax incentives allowed businesses to spread up to $300,000 as a refundable tax offset via the carryback provision for the previous 2 years. Mr Abbott's cutting of those loss carryback will hit more than 100,000 companies and will tear more than $900 million from the Australian economy. This was a law that allowed businesses to adapt to changing business and economic conditions. Similar schemes are in place in other developed economies, including the United Kingdom, France, Germany and the United States. 100,000 companies given less flexibility and having made it much harder to do business. How can that be good for business? It doesn't seem to matter to this government. It doesn't seem to matter to Mr Abbott, as long as those big miners get their money. Mr Abbott's push to strip back the minerals resource rent tax, cutting tax concessions, payments and bonuses is not only fair, it is unpopular. In an article in The Australian on November 4, the headline rang out, "Business takes aim at MRRT repeal." In the article by Sid Marr, it said, and I quote, "A top business group has attacked Tony Abbott's plans to scrap nearly $4 billion in tax concessions for mainly small businesses as part of the axing of the mining tax, arguing that it will permanently increase compliance costs and cut investment returns at a time when business is struggling." The Australian Industry Group has told the government that its plans to reduce the thresholds available under the small business asset write-off regime from $6,500 to $1,000 will add complexity and compliance costs for eligible small businesses. The AI Group Chief Executive Ines Willox said in the submission, "It will subtract from the cash flow over the next few years at a time when many small businesses are struggling, and it will reduce the return on new investment at a time when there is a weak investment outside the mining sector." The Liberal Party, the so-called friend of business, is so clouded by its determination to give money to the miners that it will hurt businesses. At a time when this country needs to be encouraging small business and diversifying the economy, Mr Abbott simply wants to rip the money out of the economy and place it back into the pockets of big miners. So that's school children, families, workers and business that all will cop it, so the miners get their money. It's a growing list of people who are unhappy with the Abbott government's move. But there's more. Australians on a raft of allowances are also set to suffer with the income support bonus. This payment provides $210 extra per year for singles and $350 extra per year for couples. Now, I have not much time left to me, but I will repeat, Madam Acting Deputy President, this bill before us is set to hit workers, family, businesses. It's an unfair bill. It's a bill that only benefits the big miners and it rips money out from those that can least afford it to give back to the big mining companies.